"Shut up, rich cowboy. Get in my bed now," the beautiful Apache girl said. It wasn't a thing you heard every day, not out in this dust-choked part of the territory where words were worth less than the spit it took to say them. But the story goes, that's what she said. Before that, though, before the words, there was the silence. A silence so loud it screamed. She stood on a wooden block in the middle of a town that wasn't a town, more like a collection of desperate shacks clinging to a dry creek bed. The sun beat down on her, on everyone, a hammer striking an anvil, and the heat came up from the ground in waves that made the whole sorry scene shimmer and dance. Her hands were bound in front of her with a length of rough rope, the fibers digging into her skin, leaving it raw and red. She didn't pull against it, hadn't in days. There was no point. The rope was just a fact, like the sun, like the thirst in her throat that felt like a fist made of sand. She wore what was left of a dress, torn and stained with things she didn't want to remember. Her hair, black as a crow's wing, was matted with dust and sweat, clinging to her neck and face. But it was her eyes people noticed if they dared to look that long. They were dark and deep and held nothing. No fear, no anger, no hope. Just a vast, empty stillness. The men watching her weren't much to look at. They were hard men, their faces burned by the sun and creased with cruelty or desperation, sometimes both. They smelled of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and chewing tobacco. They looked at her like she was a horse, checking her teeth if they could, sizing up her legs, her back, a piece of property. The auctioneer was a fat man with a stained vest and a voice that sounded like gravel being churned in a bucket. He pointed a greasy finger at her. "Look here, gentlemen. A prime specimen. Young, strong, and already broken in, won't give you no trouble. Good for cooking, cleaning, or warming your bed on a cold night." His words were flies buzzing around her, meaningless and dirty. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stood there, a statue carved from defiance and despair. The bidding started low. A few dollars, a sack of flour, a worn-out pistol. The men laughed and spat, nudging each other. It was a sport to them. The degradation was part of the price. The silence inside her was a shield. She'd learned that much. If you let the noise in, the taunts, the remembered screams of her people, the crackle of fire, you'd break. So you built a wall of silence inside your head, brick by painful brick, until you were living in a fortress no one could touch. The dust coated her tongue. She could feel the grit between her teeth. Every breath was hot and dry. She remembered water. A stream running clear and cold over smooth stones, her mother's hands dipping a gourd. The memory was a knife twisting. She pushed it away, back behind the wall. Stay empty. Stay silent. A man named Barlow, a rancher with a mean streak as wide as his gut, was leading the bidding. He had a pig's eyes, small and greedy. He kept licking his lips as he looked at her, and she knew a life with him would be a short, brutal thing. The price crept up. $30. $40. Barlow was swaggering now, looking around like he'd already won. He was picturing it. She could see it on his face. The power. The use of her. She felt a tremor in her hands, a flicker of the fire she thought was long dead. It was a dangerous feeling. Fire got you killed. The silence was safer. She focused on a loose thread on the auctioneer's vest. One detail. Anchor herself to it. Don't think about the rope. Don't think about the thirst. Don't think about the hands that would soon claim you. Just the thread. The sun beat down. The sweat trickled into her eyes, stinging. The world was a blur of heat and dust and ugly laughing faces. The hammer was about to fall. The fat man was shouting, "Sold to Mr. Barlow for $55. And in that moment, the silence inside her finally broke. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper of a thought, a single hot ember in the ash. Not him. This is a tough story to tell, and I see some of you leaning in close. If you're enjoying this tale so far, I'd appreciate it if you'd do me a favor. Go on down to the comments and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. It's always a kick to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. You're not going to want to miss how this whole thing unfolds. Trust me on that. He sat on a crate in the thin shade of the livery stable, away from the stinking knot of men around the auction block. His name was Cole. He wasn't a rich man by city standards, but out here his clean shirt and the fine leather of his boots set him apart. He had a ranch a day's ride from this hellhole, a place he'd carved out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He'd come to town for salt and flour, not for trouble. He hated towns, hated the smell, hated the people. He was a man who preferred the company of cattle and the vast, unforgiving silence of the plains. He'd seen auctions like this before. It was a sickness in this land, a rot that people either ignored or took part in. Cole just stayed away. Not his business. He had his own ghosts to wrestle with. He didn't have room for anyone else's. He watched the girl on the block. He'd seen Apache before, warriors full of fire and pride. This one was different. She was all stillness, a rock in the middle of a foul, rushing river. He noted the way she stood, straight-backed, despite the rope and the rags. He saw the emptiness in her eyes and recognized it. It was a look he knew from his own mirror on the bad nights. He didn't feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion. What he felt was a deep, grating annoyance, an irritation that these loud, filthy men were making a spectacle of a pain so profound it had burned the world away from her. He saw Barlow slap his money down on the barrelhead, a greasy, triumphant look on his face. He saw the girl flinch, just a tiny, barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. It was the first crack he'd seen in her composure, and something in him shifted. It wasn't a decision, not a thought-out plan. It was an impulse, raw and unwelcome. He was a man who lived by a strict code of non-involvement. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his own land for a reason. But the sight of Barlow reaching for her, the thought of that stillness being broken by that pig of a man, it was like a burr under his saddle. It was a problem that needed solving. He stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked from the shade into the brutal sun. The crowd parted for him slightly, noticing the cut of his clothes, the quiet deadliness in his posture. He didn't look at them. He looked at the auctioneer. "The bidding is over, friend," the fat man said a little nervously. Cole didn't answer. He just reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He didn't count the coins. He just tossed the whole heavy bag onto the barrelhead next to Barlow's pathetic stack of bills. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. Gold. A sound that cut through the drunken chatter like a gunshot. The whole crowd went silent. Even Barlow looked stunned. "That's double whatever he paid," Cole said. His voice was rough from disuse, low and flat. The auctioneer stared at the gold, his eyes wide. Greed won out over procedure in about half a second. He snatched the pouch. "Sold," he squawked, pointing a trembling finger at Cole. "To the gentleman in black." Barlow's face turned a mottled purple. "Now hold on, that ain't right." Cole didn't look at him. He stepped up to the block, pulled a knife from his belt, and in one smooth motion, cut the rope on the girl's wrists. He didn't touch her. He just tossed the knife back into its sheath. "Come on," he said, not to her specifically, but to the space she occupied. Then he turned and walked back toward the livery stable where his horse was tied, not once looking back to see if she was following. He didn't want her. He didn't know what he was going to do with her. He'd just bought a person like a sack of grain. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth. He'd broken his own rules, and now he had a problem. A silent, broken problem with empty eyes. The ride back to his ranch was silent. He rode ahead. She followed on the pack mule he'd bought along with the supplies. He didn't look back. He could feel her presence behind him, a small, steady weight in the vast emptiness of the landscape. The sun beat down. The dust rose in clouds from the horse's hooves. The world was shades of brown and scorched yellow. When they finally reached his property, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The cabin wasn't much. A single room, built of sturdy logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. It was stark, functional, and clean. A man's place, a lonely man's place. He dismounted, tied his horse to the rail, and started unloading the supplies. He still hadn't looked at her directly. He moved with a grim efficiency, as if she wasn't there. She slid off the mule and stood by its head, her small frame looking lost against the enormous sky. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. He carried the sacks of flour and salt inside, then came back out. He jerked his head toward the cabin. Inside. It was an order, blunt and without warmth. He led the animals to the corral, pumped water for them from the well. He worked through his chores methodically, the familiar rhythm a comfort against the strange new disruption in his life. When he finally went inside, she was standing exactly where he'd left her, just inside the door, a shadow in the dimming light. The cabin was one room, a cot in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in the middle, a fireplace for cooking. He lit a lantern, the yellow light pushing back the shadows. He didn't know the first thing about what to do. He'd bought her, but he wasn't Barlow. The thought made his gut clench. He wasn't that. So what was he? He pointed to the cot. That's yours. He pointed to a bucket of fresh water he'd brought in from the well and a bar of lye soap on a small washstand. Water. Then he turned his back on her and went to the fireplace. He started a fire, his movements economical. He pulled a pot from a hook, added water, beans, and some dried meat. He didn't speak again. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the scrape of the spoon against the iron pot. He was aware of her every movement behind him. He heard the soft splash of water, the quiet scrub of the soap. He was giving her privacy by not looking, a small, unspoken courtesy. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls. He set one on the table for himself and pushed the other one to the far side along with a spoon. He sat down and started eating. He didn't invite her, didn't tell her to eat. He just provided. After a long moment, he heard the scrape of the other chair as she sat down. He heard the small click of the spoon against the bowl. He kept his eyes on his own food. They ate in complete silence. When he was done, he noticed the raw, chafed skin on her wrists, angry and red from the rope. He got up, went to a small chest, and took out a tin of salve. It was the same stuff he used on the horses for rope burn. He walked over to her, uncapped the tin. She flinched when he reached for her hand, her eyes finally showing a spark of fear. He stopped. He just held out the open tin, a silent offering. She stared at it, then at him. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and took it from him. He went back to his side of the room, laid out a bedroll for himself on the floor, as far from her cot as he could get. He blew out the lantern. The fire threw dancing shadows on the walls. He lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of her breathing, and wondered what in God's name he had done. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. They lived in a world of silence, punctuated by the necessary sounds of survival. The chop of an axe, the sizzle of food in a pan, the creak of the well pump. He worked his land, she worked the cabin. An unspoken arrangement fell into place. He never told her to do anything. He'd just wake up and the floor would be swept, or he'd come in from mending a fence and there would be a pot of something simmering over the fire. She was a ghost in his house, quiet and efficient. She mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She learned the rhythm of his life and fitted herself into its cracks. He still barely looked at her. He'd leave a bowl of food for her or a bucket of water. He spoke only in single words. Wood, water, careful. She never spoke at all. Her silence was a presence, a weight in the small cabin. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps, the soft rustle of her movements. One afternoon he was out behind the cabin, splitting logs. The work was hard, physical, a way to sweat out the thoughts that plagued him. She came out and stood a ways off, watching. He ignored her, bringing the axe down again and again. Thwack, thwack, thwack. After a while, he stopped to wipe the sweat from his brow. He glanced over and saw she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, at a small, fenced-off patch of ground 100 yards away. There were 2 simple wooden crosses there, weathered by the sun and wind. His breath caught in his throat. He never went there. He never looked at it if he could help it. He put the axe down and walked over to where she stood. He didn't mean to. His feet just took him. He stood beside her, his gaze following hers to the 2 graves. The silence stretched. It was different this time, not empty, but full of unspoken questions. He cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet air. "My wife," he said, his voice a low rasp. He pointed to the larger cross. "And my son." He didn't say their names, he couldn't. Diphtheria, 2 winters back. The words were stones he'd been carrying, and he just dropped them at her feet. Simple, blunt. A fact like the sun or the dirt. He expected her to say nothing, to just turn and go back inside. But she didn't. She stayed there, looking at the graves. Then she spoke. Her voice was rusty, quiet, like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long time. "My village," she began, and her gaze went far away to a place he couldn't see. Soldiers came, they had blue coats, fire. She didn't tell it like a story. She told it like a list of ingredients. Fire, smoke, the smell of burning homes, the screams of people she knew. Her brother, running, a gunshot. Her mother pulling her, telling her to hide. The silence after. The men who came back, the ones who weren't soldiers, the ones who took what was left. She didn't cry. Her voice was as flat and empty as her eyes had been in that town. She was just reciting facts, a truth as hard and real as his two graves. He listened. He didn't offer comfort. He wouldn't have known how. He just stood there beside her, a man with a dead family, listening to a woman with a dead world. And in that shared space of loss, in the shadow of his crosses and the memory of her ashes, the first thread of something other than survival was spun between them. The sky had been a strange color for 2 days, a bruised yellowish gray that promised violence. The air was thick and still, so heavy you felt like you were breathing water. Cole knew the signs. A bad storm was coming, a real monster of a prairie storm that could tear the roof off a cabin and scatter cattle for miles. He'd spent the day securing everything he could. He reinforced the corral, checked the shutters on the cabin, and brought in extra firewood and water. He worked with a grim urgency, his jaw tight. The girl, he still didn't know her name, just called her you in his head, worked alongside him. She didn't need to be told. She saw the sky, she felt the air. She gathered kindling, secured the clothesline, her movements quick and sure. A different kind of unity had formed between them since the day by the graves. It wasn't warmth, but it was a solid, practical understanding. We are two people in a hard place. We survived together. The storm hit just after dusk. It came on with a roar, a wall of wind and rain that slammed into the little cabin. The wind howled like a dying animal. Rain lashed against the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown. The whole structure groaned and shuddered. Cole stood by the window, peering out into the maelstrom. She was by the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood, keeping a steady flame going. Light against the dark, warmth against the cold. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howl of the wind. A crack, loud as a cannon shot, followed by a splintering crash. The massive cottonwood tree by the corral, a tree that had stood for 100 years, had been struck by lightning. A huge branch, thick as a man's body, had crashed down and shattered a section of the corral fence. "Damn it," Cole muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the windowsill. The horses, they'd panic, they'd bolt through the broken fence and be lost to the storm. He'd find their broken bodies in a week, scattered across the plains. He turned, grabbing his heavy rain slicker. "Stay here," he ordered. It was the first full sentence he'd directed at her in a while. He didn't wait for a reply, just pulled on the slicker and his hat, grabbed a lantern, and headed for the door. Before he could open it, she was there, blocking his path. She had his spare slicker in her hands, holding it out to him. Her face was set, determined. In her other hand, she held a length of rope. "No," he said. "Too dangerous. You stay." She just shook her head. She didn't say a word, but her eyes did. "You go, I go. We survive together." It was a statement, not a request. There was no time to argue. The wind tore at the door as he opened it. He took the other slicker, knowing it was useless to fight her. They stepped out into chaos. The rain was a solid sheet of water, cold and blinding. The wind tried to tear them from their feet. The lantern cast a wild, dancing circle of light that was barely enough to see. They fought their way to the corral. The horses were screaming, their eyes wild with terror, rearing and crashing against the remaining fences. The broken section was a gaping hole leading out into the black, howling wilderness. He had to get a rope on the lead mare, get her calmed down. If he could control her, the others might follow. He handed the lantern to the girl. "Hold this. Keep it steady," he yelled over the wind. He moved into the corral, his voice a low, calming rumble as he tried to approach the terrified animals. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky, turning the world into a stark, terrifying photograph for a split second. In that flash, he saw the big gelding rear up, its hooves flailing, its eyes rolling back in its head. It was going to stampede, straight for the opening. He was on the wrong side, he couldn't get there in time. Then he saw her move. She didn't hesitate. She was a blur of motion. She dropped the lantern, grabbed the rope she'd carried, and ran straight at the opening, placing her small body directly in the path of 1,000 pounds of panicking horse. For a heartbeat, he was sure he was going to watch her die, but she didn't scream or run. She stood her ground, raised her arms, and let out a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the storm. It wasn't a sound of fear. It was a command. The gelding, already in motion, swerved at the last second, startled by the sound and the sudden, defiant figure in its path. It crashed back into the other horses, a chaotic tangle of animal fear. That was all the time Cole needed. He got the rope around the mare's neck, pulled her close, and started talking to her, his voice the one anchor in the storm. It took another hour of brutal, exhausting work, but together they managed to herd the terrified animals into the small, sturdy barn. When they finally stumbled back into the cabin, they were soaked to the bone, shivering, and covered in mud. They collapsed on the floor in front of the fire, too tired to even take off their wet clothes. The storm still raged outside, but inside, in the small circle of firelight, there was a new kind of silence. The silence of a battle fought and won. Together, they sat by the fire, steam rising from their wet clothes. The shared danger had burned away some of the distance between them. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a problem or a responsibility, but as the person who had stood her ground in the heart of a storm. Her hair was plastered to her face, her borrowed slicker was caked in mud, but her eyes, lit by the fire, held a strength that humbled him. He got up and found a bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, or for nights when the ghosts got too loud. He poured 2 fingers into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a second. Her hand was small, but her grip on the cup was firm. He poured one for himself and sat back down. They drank in silence, the burn of the liquor a welcome warmth in their chilled bodies. He watched the way the firelight played on her face, carving new lines and shadows. She was like something carved from desert rock, all hard angles and hidden resilience. He was a man of stone, built of grief and solitude. She was fire, a spark of it anyway that refused to be extinguished. The storm had shown him that. Out on the prairie, you learned to read the land, the sky, the animals. He was learning to read her too. In her silences, in the way she moved, in the quick, efficient way she'd splinted the leg of a calf that had gotten tangled in wire last week. He hadn't asked her to. He'd just found it done. He'd been thrown from his horse once, a bad fall that twisted his knee. He'd lain on the ground, the pain a white-hot flare, thinking this was it. This was how he'd end, alone and broken a mile from his own cabin. But then she was there. He never knew how she'd found him. She'd gotten him to his feet, her shoulder under his arm, and half-dragged, half-carried him home. She had the strength of a mule packed into a tiny frame. She'd cleaned the wound, wrapped it tightly, and for the next few days, she'd done everything. She'd chopped the wood, hauled the water, fed the stock, and hunted for food with the old shotgun he kept by the door. He'd watched her, helpless and frustrated, from his cot. He saw her check the perimeter of the cabin every night before barring the door. He saw the way she handled the gun, awkward at first, but with a grim determination. She was a survivor. They both were. They had that in common. They were 2 solitary animals who had, by some strange twist of fate, formed a pack of 2. The storm outside began to quiet down, the wind's howl softening to a low moan. The whiskey had warmed him through. He felt a strange urge to talk, to fill the silence with something other than the crackle of the fire. But he didn't have the words. His language was action, gesture. He reached over and gently took her hand, turning it over to look at the palm. It was calloused, rough from work, but there were faint silvery scars there too, old ones. He traced one with his thumb, a question he didn't know how to ask. She didn't pull her hand away. She just watched his face in the firelight. Her expression was unreadable. He let her hand go. The moment passed. He got up and put another log on the fire. When he turned back, she was watching him with an intensity that made him feel seen. It was an uncomfortable feeling, like being out in the open without cover. He wasn't just a man who'd bought her anymore. He wasn't just a reluctant savior. And she wasn't just a victim. They were something else now, something forged in storms and silence. and he had no idea what to call it. A month later, they were running low on supplies. The trip to town was unavoidable. He hated it, hated the thought of taking her back there, but it had to be done. The ride was tense. The closer they got to the collection of shacks, the more he could feel her withdraw, rebuilding the wall of silence around herself. He felt a protective anger rise in him, hot and unfamiliar. He'd gotten used to the quiet strength she wore at the ranch. He didn't want to see the emptiness return to her eyes. The town was just as he remembered, dusty, mean, and full of staring eyes. As they rode down the main street, conversation stopped. People turned to watch. He could hear the whispers start up like the buzz of flies. He kept his face a mask of indifference, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He could feel her, riding beside him on the mule, shrink into herself. They stopped in front of the general store. "Wait here," he said, his voice low and hard. He swung down from his horse. Before he could go inside, the store owner, a weaselly man named Peterson, came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. "Cole," he said, his eyes flicking from Cole to the girl and back again. "Didn't expect to see you. Or her." The insinuation was thick and ugly. "I need flour, salt, coffee," Cole said, ignoring the bait. From across the street he saw Barlow. He was leaning against a post with two of his cronies, a bottle of whiskey being passed between them. Barlow saw them, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He started walking toward them. Cole's hand instinctively dropped to rest on the butt of his pistol. Inside the store he could hear two women talking, their voices sharp and carrying in the quiet street. "That's the one he bought. The Savage. Paid a fortune, I heard. Can you imagine? Living out there all alone with that, it ain't decent. He always was a strange one. Ever since his wife." The voices trailed off as they noticed him standing in the doorway. They scurried away like mice. Cole's jaw ached from clenching it. He got his supplies, paid in silence, and walked back out. Barlow and his men were there, blocking his way to the horses. Well, look what the cat dragged in," Barlow slurred, his piggish eyes fixed on the girl. "Been treating my property good, Cole?" "She ain't your property," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out of my way, Barlow." Barlow laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "I see you got her trained up nice, quiet and obedient. That what you like? You paid a high price for a squaw. I'd have given you a better deal on a good cow." His men snickered. The girl didn't move. She just stared at a point somewhere over Barlow's shoulder, her face a blank canvas. But he could see the tension in her hands, the way they were knotted together. Cole took a step forward. "I'm not gonna say it again." Barlow took a swig from his bottle and then looked the girl up and down in a way that made Cole's blood run cold. "Just wanted to see what $100 of merchandise looks like up close." He reached out a grimy hand, as if to touch her face. Cole moved. He didn't draw his gun. He just stepped between them, his body a solid wall. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Barlow. His eyes were flat, gray, and completely empty of any emotion except a deadly seriousness. It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a promise. Barlow, for all his drunken bluster, was a coward. He saw something in Cole's eyes that sobered him up fast. He hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. Then he let it drop. He spat on the ground near Cole's feet. "You keep your pet," he snarled. "She ain't worth the trouble." He turned and swaggered back across the street with his men. Cole stood there for a long moment, his back to her, his body still rigid. He had placed himself between her and the world. The line he'd tried so hard to maintain, the distance, the non-involvement, it was gone. It had vanished in a dusty street in a town he hated, all because of a single silent glance. The ride home was even quieter than the ride in, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was thick with the thing that had happened in town, the line he had crossed. He hadn't just bought her, hadn't just sheltered her. He had defended her. He had stood for her. That changed everything. He could feel her gaze on his back the whole way. It wasn't empty now. It was questioning, searching. Back at the cabin, the familiar routine felt different. He unsaddled the horses. She started putting away the supplies, but the space between them vibrated with unspoken energy. He had broken his own code. The man who wanted to be left alone had publicly declared that he was not, that they were not to be messed with. He felt raw, exposed. That night he couldn't settle. He paced the small cabin like a caged wolf. He was angry at Barlow, angry at the town, but mostly he was angry at himself. Angry for getting involved, for letting this woman, this stranger, get under his skin and into the fortress he'd built around his heart. He'd had a life once, a wife, a son, laughter in this cabin, and then he'd had nothing but the silence and the graves. He'd made a vow to himself to never feel that kind of loss again, and the only way to do that was to never have anything to lose. He stopped his pacing and stared into the fire, his hands clenched into fists. This was a mistake. All of it. Buying her, bringing her here, letting her stay. He was a fool. He was just setting himself up for more pain. He muttered something under his breath, a curse at his own weakness. He felt her eyes on him. He turned, and she was standing there by the table watching him. The firelight cast a soft glow on her face. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, unnerving understanding. It was as if she could see right through his anger to the terrified man beneath it. She saw him, the real him, not the quiet rancher or the reluctant savior. She saw the man drowning in his own solitude, and that's when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through his turmoil like a knife. He was muttering about the trouble, about how he was a rich man. He could leave this all behind. He didn't need this complication, this feeling. He was spiraling, lost in his own head. "Shut up, rich cowboy. Get in my bed now," the beautiful Apache girl said. The words hung in the air, shocking in their directness, but it wasn't what it sounded like, not a crude demand. The bed wasn't just the cot in the corner. The bed was this life, this cabin, this partnership they had forged. It was a command to stop fighting, to stop pacing the cage of his past. It was an invitation to stop being alone, to be here, now, with her. He stared at her, speechless. All his anger, all his fear, just evaporated. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a symbol of his complication, but as a person, a woman of immense strength and courage who was offering him a lifeline. He took a shaky breath. The frantic energy left him, replaced by a profound stillness. He walked over to her, stopping just before her. The air crackled between them. He had so many questions. Who was she? Where did this strength come from? But he only asked the most important one. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She held his gaze. A small, sad smile touched her lips for the first time. "Anawa," she said. The name was a gift, a final piece of her trust, offered in the quiet of the cabin. Anawa. He said it to himself, a silent prayer. It felt solid, real. It was the name of the woman who had stood her ground in a storm and stared down the ugliness of the world. It was the name of the woman who had just saved him from himself. Spring came to the high plains, a slow, hesitant greening of the brown land. The brutal wind softened, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life instead of ice. The silence in the cabin had changed again. It was a comfortable silence now, the easy quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for constant words. Cole's limp was almost gone, and the anger that had been his constant companion for 2 years had loosened its grip. Anawa, the name was a fixture in his mind now, solid and true, had brought a different kind of life to the place. She moved with a quiet purpose, her presence a steady warmth like the sun on the porch steps. One morning, Cole went out to the small fenced-in plot of land, the one with the 2 crosses. He'd never touched the soil there, had let it go fallow, a monument to his loss. But today was different. He took a shovel and for the first time since he'd dug the graves, he turned the earth. The work was hard. The ground was packed and stubborn, but he kept at it, breaking up the clumps, pulling the weeds, preparing the soil. He didn't know why he was doing it. It just felt like something that had to be done. After an hour, she came out of the cabin. Anawa. She watched him for a moment, then went to the small leather pouch she always kept with her, the only thing she'd had when he'd bought her. She opened it and poured a handful of seeds into her palm. Corn, beans, squash, the 3 sisters. Seeds from her old life, from her dead world, that she had carried all this way. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent on the newly turned soil. She didn't say a word. She just knelt down and began to plant, pushing the seeds into the earth with her thumb, one by one. She was planting them right there in the same patch of ground that held his past, his pain. He stopped his work and watched her. He understood. This wasn't about forgetting what was buried there. It was about planting something new alongside it, a future right in the soil of his grief. He knelt down beside her. She showed him how to plant the corn in a mound, how to plant the beans at its base so they could climb the stalk, how to plant the squash around them to shade the ground and keep the weeds out. They worked together, their hands in the same dirt, under the same gentle sun, his large calloused fingers clumsy next to her sure deft ones. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The action was the only conversation that mattered. They were planting a garden. They were building a home. They were taking two broken pasts and planting a single shared future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their work, they stood up and looked at the small, freshly planted plot. It wasn't much, just a patch of dark earth full of hope. It was a seed of belonging, sown in the most unlikely of places. If you liked this story, and I hope you did, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button to let me know. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because there are a whole lot more stories where this one came from, and you won't want to miss a single one.